I get a chance to tell some quick stories and then introduce some good friends of mine. I think more partners in crime now moved beyond the friends part. When I first arrived here 5 years ago, whenever 2015 was, one of the things coming from the place that I came from, I wanted to know who was doing the work in the neighborhood, who was doing the community development work, the work with the poor and the widow and the orphan and the stranger among us. And so I was asking other community leaders who was doing that work. And one was Betty DeForest. And so I met with Betty DeForest. But the other one that kept coming up, including from Betty DeForest, who was at the South Hayward Parish, was, Jake, you have to go meet Captain Marty Neideffer. And I was like, who? And they said, Captain Marty Neideffer. And I said, Captain in the Salvation Army, Captain, like this is what I'm used to. They said, no, Captain in the Sheriff's Department. I said, I'm sorry, one more time. You said Captain in the Sheriff's Department. I said, tell me about that. And so I called Captain Marty. I emailed Captain Marty, and we went and we met. And I was just absolutely blown away by, in my language, in my faith tradition, what God is doing in our Sheriff's Department here in Alameda County in terms of community development. And you're going to hear more about that because Marty and Hilary, who I met later as the executive director of the Deputy Sheriff's Activity League. And so I met with Marty, and Marty essentially said to me, Jake, the role of police or public safety, probably for better language, needs to move on just the enforcement of laws and move towards the prevention of crime. And so he was doing, and they're doing as DSAL, incredible work on the ground. They're offering soccer programs to over 2,000 students for free in the neighborhood of Ashland and to build relationships between deputies and people each other and create community and create space where things can happen in lives besides crime, where, hey, wait a minute, what are the causes of these crimes? And let's start alleviating some of those. It's poverty, it's opportunity, it's lack of resources. And I was saying, am I in a meeting with a community developer or am I meeting with a captain in the Sheriff's Department? And constantly, in that space, they've done some incredible work. I know for many of us, our experiences with the Sheriff's Department or law enforcement have not been good. And so in a lot of ways, I know that when we share from that space, that a lot of us come to that table with trauma already involved. And so my invitation to you today is, as Marty and Hilary, if you guys are coming up here, this is Marty and Hilary that will be part of our conversation today. Captain Marty Neideffer and Executive Director Hilary Bass. So with full disclosure, they roped me onto serving on the board. So I now serve on the board of DSAL. And what we've been doing is working on how do we revolutionize what policing looks like today. How do we do it with the most love and care and concern possible in the middle of this space? So I'm going to ask some questions. I'm going to invite you to come to this conversation with as much of an open mind and kind of open heart as possible while honoring the real stories that happen in our neighborhood that feel hard, especially when we engage law enforcement or public safety and what that might look or feel like. So, first question, Marty. Tell us about yourself, your journey in the Sheriff's Department, and what you hope to see in your role in the next few years.
Sure. Well, thanks, Pastor Jake, for having us, and thank you, all of you, for allowing us to come to your services this morning. Appreciate it. So my name is Marty Neideffer. I'm a captain with the Sheriff's Office. I started with the Sheriff's Office in '97. I was 33 years old, so I was a new deputy at one point, but I was never a young deputy, and I think that's been part of my experience here. I've worked in the jail. I worked as a patrolman. I worked as a school resource officer. Promoted to sergeant in, I think, 05 or 06.
Marty, it's going to be important. You got to hold the mic close to your mouth.
Sure. Is that better?
There you go. There you go.
All right. So I promoted to sergeant in 2005 and 6, and from there, I stayed in that spot through my time as a sergeant, as a lieutenant, and now as a captain, and built out what we now call what we have always called our Youth and Family Services Bureau, but which expanded from a few people now to probably 45 or 50 people, including deputies, behavioral health professionals, and Hilary, who is a civilian employee who oversees our deputy sheriff's activities lead.
Great. Hilary, same question. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey, kind of how you arrived at the Sheriff's Department, and what you're hoping to see in the next few years in your role.
Hi, I'm Hilary. Thank you also for having us. So I met Marty back in 2004 or 5. I started working in Ashland at a affordable housing complex operated by Mercy Housing, and my job was to help serve the residents there. And I knew nothing about the area. I'm from San Francisco, born and raised, and I had never been past the Oakland airport, actually. So it was a brand new area for me, but I learned to ask questions and be open to hearing. So I made no assumptions about what was happening, but the kids, mostly the adults didn't talk to me for a while, but kids started talking to me. I started an after-school program, and they told me all of the things that were going on in the area related to issues that they were struggling with related to violence and prostitution and drugs and fights and struggles at home, lack of money. And it really opened my eyes and made me realize that all of the things that I had been exposed to in San Francisco that I sort of took for granted, I realized sort of didn't exist in Ashland. It almost seemed like a blank canvas. So when Marty and I met, we realized that we had a similar goal, which is to sort of repaint this canvas so that it had more options for young people and their families to be successful. And we've been on that path for that whole time. I think that's like 15 or so years now. And I think that it continues to be our goal to learn and listen and understand what matters to people and that would help them feel good in the world. And then what could we do to add color to this canvas and make that possible?
Thank you, Hilary. You both are doing some pretty amazing work and live on the ground here in the Eden area and have done some pretty amazing building of community advocacy systems and listening, and I love kind of hearing those stories. So I'm asking if you to share, when you look and breathe and live in our local community, where do you see the brokenness, the lack of resourcing, and especially for our conversation today, the impacts of violence?
Sure. So Hilary kind of laid out the trajectory of our efforts, and it really has been a 15-year kind of a learning process. And over that time, so my experience as a deputy sheriff going into people's homes was over time that a lot of behavior stemmed as a consequence of poverty. People, I have to tell a story. I was a school resource officer, and we used to have kids come into our classrooms brought in by the teachers for us to give them the lesson about how to do the right thing and not the wrong thing, how to join a baseball team rather than join a gang, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I would have these conversations with these kids, and then they would turn around and tell me, Dep, we don't have the money to go do that, right? So slowly it became very clear to me that an area that I grew up in, actually, the Ashland area, had changed fairly significantly relative to the socioeconomic status of many of the people there. It's $19,000 a year median income, individual median income in the Ashland Cherryland area, if you didn't know that. So over time, it became clear that socioeconomic reality became clear, and then we learned how that impacts health. There's greater health disparities in these communities of poverty, and that overlaps into safety concerns. So all of these elements of public safety, public health, economic development, workforce development, they're all interconnected to ultimately having a safe community. And if we're, as the sheriff's office don't engage in that, don't recognize that, then we're not doing all that we can to help do our job, which is to create a safe community. So, so the lack of investment in many communities, including our own, has led to many sort of overlapping social conditions that drive crime and drive recidivism.
Great, thank you. Hilary, same question. When you look at our local community, as you kind of live, breathe, and work there, where do you see the brokenness, the lack of resourcing, and most especially the impact of violence?
I think that over the years, it's really stood out to me that so I just learned this term recently called social infrastructure, and I think that actually this place is a perfect example of social infrastructure. It's a beautiful place where there's a seat for everybody and there's a reason to come together and connect. And I personally just today haven't said hello or good morning to so many strangers in a really long time. But that only happens.
We will do that to you.
I like it. I like it a lot. It feels good. But that only happens because this place exists and the doors are open and we can all come here together on this day and time. And I noticed we've noticed over the years that these communities, specifically Ashland and Cherryland, don't have a lot of social infrastructure. There's not a lot of natural opportunities for people to connect in a really positive way. There's no parks. There's no plaza. There's no farmer's market. There's no place to go listen to music every once in a while. And just because you're low income doesn't mean that that's something you don't want. And we're all human beings, and it's something we actually all need. And so one of the number one issues or calls for service in the area where his deputies have to respond are related to 5150s or mental health issues and substance abuse and domestic violence. And, I think these things, when we feel isolated and we feel like we're surrounded by concrete and we don't know how to connect with one another, it leads to depression and anxiety and things that might lead to substance usage, and that might lead to violence. So one very specific story where I feel like it really kind of became clear, we built these little soccer fields kind of out of nothing on this piece of concrete in the area. Very simple. We got a grant. We used every penny of it to build this little space. And all of a sudden, people were coming to play soccer and walking there, on streets that don't even have sidewalks, but to get to this little tiny soccer pitch. And one summer, I went out there just to see how people were experiencing the space. And I talked to this one mom, and she said, I've known you for a couple years through soccer, but I have to tell you something. I never told you that I've been depressed for many, many years, and I often can't get out of bed. It has impacted my marriage. We fight. This is a problem. But I have these 3 kids. It's summer. I need them to be doing something, so I keep taking them here to this little soccer park. And I've been out here every day watching them play, and then all these moms are coming out, and we had a little Zumba class. Well, I can't call it Zumba. I'll get in trouble. We call it muevete. There's Zumba police, I've heard. And she said, so the ladies invited me to do muevete with them, so I started, while my kids were playing soccer, I started doing muevete. And then after muevete, us moms would kick the ball around, and that was fun. And then after that, we would sit on the benches that you put here, and we would chit-chat. And now I know all these women, and I got to tell you, I feel a lot better. And I think that to go back to this number one issue around mental health, which translates as a safety issue, this piece of social infrastructure played a really important role. And I think that that's the opportunity, is to keep investing in social infrastructure.
Can I just add one more?
Yeah, absolutely.
One more thing, Jake. Just because it's because you asked about the violence aspect of it, and to me, this homelessness epidemic is something terribly violent about that in its own way. And so we used to before Proposition 47, which reduced a bunch of felony drug charges to misdemeanors, we used to put people who were drug addicts in jail. Proposition 47 changed that dynamic. I actually voted for Proposition 47. But we didn't create another system to accommodate the issues that folks face when they're in that set of circumstances. And homelessness has a number of different faces to it, but substantial faces to it include people who are dealing with substance abuse issues and mentally ill people. And we do not have a system. The state does not have a system sufficient to accommodate that problem. And I think we can do a lot of different things to ameliorate that issue, but unless and until we create a system to handle it, we're going to be fighting an uphill battle on that issue.
Marty and Hilary have been educating me as they live and breathe what systemic change looks like within our public safety and officer of the peace realities, right? Like, how do we create a safe and just community, right, for all? And no matter what socioeconomic place or skin tone or racial ethnic heritage, how do we do that? And so what they're putting forward, and they're going to talk about just for a little bit, is this: in the middle of these pockets of what feel hopelessness and never-ending and the violence that kind of feeds upon the violence and the poverty circles that feed upon the poverty circles, is saying, wait a minute, we're just going to refuse and we're going to bring a pocket of hope to that. And they've been doing that in many different ways. I'll share about it a little bit later, but one of those is through what's called community capitals policing, which will be a new method, a revolution into the public safety way that we do it. And so I've asked them to share just a little bit, having lived, breathed it. Marty and Hilary, what is community capitals policing, and why do you think it's just so important to our communities and to our world?
So the term community capitals is unfortunately not one that we invented. We like to take credit for it, but that would be lying. And that's really sounds like a bad thing to do while sitting in this building.
So I wrote it's Dr. Cornelia Butler Flora actually did the work on it.
Appropriate credit due.
Well done. We are live streaming, so I'm sure she's watching.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So it's actually an economic model, and it basically is I guess it's a theory, but I think it's the truth, that if you invest in these 7 buckets, basically, then you're going to have a more thriving economy. And what we've examined in that is that, well, all of the work we've been doing over the last 15 years is really in these different buckets, which I'll say. So if we invest in these buckets for a thriving economy, we're likely going to have a similar outcome on public safety. So the capitals within the community capitals model, there's 7. It's built capital, natural capital, economic capital, human capital, social capital, political capital, and natural capital. Did I say that? Oh, cultural capital. And, and I think that, so we could explain each of those, but built capital, like just this place, this is a piece of built capital that will change the patterns of life and behavior because we all were able to walk into it today because it exists, or a park space. Cultural capital, being able to access music. I mean, just listening to you all this morning, this is something that we need as human beings. But each of these capitals, they really are exactly that. They're just things that we all need as human beings, and it's almost too common sense to, it's almost just too common sense, too much common sense.
Just add to that there, so we embark on projects that address each of those capital buckets. We being the members of the Deputy Sheriff's Activities, we being deputies and people within the Sheriff's Office. We had deputies who built these soccer fields that Hilary was talking about down on East 14th Street. So the way that connects with policing is that there's a thing called community policing. It's an actual thing. It's a concept that arose that is aspirational, I think, and seeks to have a public safety system that is that arises in concert with the professional police department and the people, that there's a true partnership there, a communication, not community events where the cops come and tell you how many people they arrested and what they did, but where community and community groups are part of the process of determining solutions, identifying the problems first, and then coming up with solutions and how to implement those solutions. So that community capitals model, the quest of addressing those capital buckets leads us to a place where the sheriff's office now is engaged in conversations about how to address issues in the most authentic way I think the sheriff's office has ever been involved in that, and with the most robust partnerships it's ever been involved in discussing that with. So it's a way, in fact, if you go to Eden Township Substation, you go up to the second floor, you're going to see a bunch of people in the police station, Hilary and her team primarily, and people who come up for meetings from all different agencies and community groups and so forth, who you would have never seen in that building before. And so it's opened up the agency to that process. So.
And one last thing about that
Great.
is that each of those capitals really does require a partner in another sector. So economic development is not something that, that either of us necessarily had experience in or would have been required to have experience in the sheriff's office, but we realize that there's a need for more jobs to exist in this community. So what do and who do we talk to help figure out how to start a social enterprise doing urban farming or building a commercial kitchen, because that's going to help grow a food economy. That has required so many different partners because it's not really our lane. And same with murals. Like, you have a sheriff's office doing murals on a corridor because we applied for grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, so that for the first time you have a sheriff's office getting art money because art is connected to safety. And so because of the sort of acknowledgement that each of these 7 capitals are required for a healthy, safe community, it forces us to look for partners to help invest differently in those different areas.
Thank you. There's this reality, and I'm going to ask you, it might be a tough question or it might be easy, but the reality that what we experience today from deputies and law enforcement is primarily somebody wearing weapons of violence or self-defense to violence, however you want to look at that. What is it going to take, in your opinion, for public safety / law enforcement to really move towards and become truly officers of the peace? What do you think it's going to take for that to happen?
So I would first say that I think in many ways they already are, in ways that many people don't see or don't understand that exists already. But how what we're talking about links to what you just asked. So there's a thing called police legitimacy, and what's the other term? Procedural justice. Procedural justice essentially means that has 2 components. One is that the police department has to enforce the law competently, and the other one is that the people for whom you're enforcing the law, they have to believe that you're doing that, that you're of them when you do that, right? That you carry their values. You're a neighbor, right? And that what you do out there to enforce the law, they can trust because they know you so well. It would be something you would do if you were put in those circumstances. And I think what we're trying to achieve, and where this business, this industry, the law enforcement industry needs to go, is that it needs to root itself in communities. It needs to hyper-localize itself. And I think that's true of all local government. And I think over the years we've detached, and we've gone to our reinforced security buildings, and we've professionalized ourselves and detached ourselves from the people. And there's probably been reasons for that, but that has to change. And people have to be, I think it changes when when law enforcement people, when public safety people realize what it is that's driving issues in neighborhoods, up to and including the history that peoples have experienced, and the history of the country, and all of that kind of a thing, and that their sort of mandate has become larger than enforcing very narrow laws.
Just to add one more thing about that, I also think that, I think deputies should be doing that and getting to know people, but I also think that, government in general is just made up of people, a whole bunch of individuals, and there's people making decisions for other people without knowing what those people need or want, and I think it's all because of that detachment, and it would be awesome if people within every department of our government locally had that same theory that it would, or value that they should know the community and understand what those issues are. And I just I just mentioned briefly there's like several streets that don't have sidewalks. Like this is still a thing where there are people that don't have a sidewalk to walk down. Like I wonder how that feels. Like I wonder how, that's going to cause other safety issues or other types of feelings. But it's somebody's in government. It would be somebody's job to actually learn, like, how is this impacting people? What can I do to make a situation better and really understand those true issues at the core of the community?
Yeah, and just to provide an example, one of the projects that we worked on, the Sheriff's Office actually provided the initial funding, about 110, 120 grand, to create the Ashland Community Association a number of years ago, or recreated. It existed, but then it died, and then we recreated it. And actually deputies, we had two deputies, Jairo Chavez and Charles Joe, who did a lot of the initial community organizing work around that. And that's one of our prouder accomplishments. And because that's becomes an organization that can speak back to us from the community, and it just is. It's a role that you wouldn't typically see a law enforcement officer engage in, but in the long run, it will have a greater impact on public safety in our neighborhoods than 11,550 under the influence, or 1,000 11,550 under the influence of drugs arrest, right? Because it begins to work towards creating a neighborhood, creating the infrastructure, the civic infrastructure that allows us to get ahead of problems.
Thank you. Last question. This is an amazing body of praying people. I listed off some, but just to give you a bit of a scope, Sheriff's Department and DSAL has launched the recreational soccer league that's in Ashland and Cherryland, where 2,000 kids and families, the boxing gym at the Sunset Adult School, about to open a fitness center in the same place, are offering pseudo Zumba classes, and all those different components. It's a unique, and it's hard. That work is hard. If you drive up Fairmount, by the way, also you'll see more of their work, the Sheriff's Department and DSAL again, with a big mural on the side that says pharmacy on it. That's the food hub. That's a creative hub for local entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship, as well as the farms they've created with Dig Deep's Farms, which provides jobs and healthy food, and trying to eliminate all that kind of work, the futsal courts that are about to get built, so on and so forth. So just for me, there's a lot to pray for in the middle of that, as well as talking through the social change and the systemic change that you guys want to see. But last question would be, how can we be praying for your work, for you, and for our community in a more effective way?
That's a tough question. How can you be participating in the work? So I think all of those projects that Jake alluded to will come to fruition over the next year or two, and become, and they will create a new sort of reality in our neighborhoods and with our work that will allow us to sort of plateau and then springboard from there. But I feel like one of the area, so that's we have great trajectory there. I think where this work will go or should go is we need to do a better job around our corrections work and our reentry work and creating systems and a methodology, a philosophy of reentry, of citizens coming back into the community after doing their time. That's effective. That's evidence-based. That's connected to the rest of the system. And if that's a hard flippant thing to do. So that's where I would seek your petitions and prayers.
I think for me, I think that, and I think the point of your topic today with peace and getting there requires a lot of work and effort. And if there are things that we're seeing that we don't like, I think it's important we ask ourselves what would be better. How could I imagine this being different? And I think that's the question we've asked ourselves over the years. What can I do to make this different or have a different outcome? And I think that effort, when you try something different, doesn't always work, but it's definitely worth the try. And I think that one of the challenges we've faced is, I think, particularly being within the sheriff's office, is that when you have so many people that feel really strongly in a negative way about police, and then you have that same agency trying something new, and some people, though they want change, are not quite sure they want us to be the ones doing that change. So it becomes a bit of a conundrum. Like, well, we got to try something if we want a different outcome. So I would ask that if you see people trying to do something different, encourage it along, because it's way better than just allowing the status quo to remain. And it's hard work, and we all need encouragement to keep trying to do things differently.
Amen to that. Round of applause for these folks for joining us.
Hey,
Thank
can I
you.
just tell one quick story before you wrap it up?
Sure.
One quick story, right?
Yeah.
One quick story before we wrap it up. My family, we had the opportunity to take a vacation to Italy a couple weeks ago, which trip of our lifetime, right? And part of that, we went to the Vatican, and as we're taking a tour through the Vatican, our tour guide tells us that Pope Francis has set up temporary accommodations and showers and other services for the homeless of the Rome and the Vatican area. And the first thing that I thought of when I heard that in the Vatican was, that's what Pastor Jake's doing. So
And all these folks.
and all of you folks, right? So, and honestly, I'm not trying to disparage anyone, but I've not heard a lot of other churches stepping up to do that kind of work. And so Pope Francis, Pastor Jake, two of the leading religious leaders of our time, straight up, thanks.
No problem. Thank you. You guys are great. Thank you.